The advertisement had been printed on cheap paper, the ink slightly smeared at the edges, and Bernard Thatcher had read it 3 times before he set it down on the rough-hewn table of his ranch house and stared out the dusty window at the endless Kansas plains stretching before him like a promise nobody had kept yet. She was described in the advertisement as capable and quiet, and Bernard read that and said, out loud to nobody, that he had been looking for both his whole life. It was the spring of 1879, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, sat right on the edge of what most men called civilization, and what the wind seemed to regard as a personal challenge. Bernard Thatcher was 34 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from actual work rather than pretension, with dark hair that had begun to silver at the temples and hands that bore the particular calluses of a man who had spent over a decade building something from nothing. He had come to Kansas in 1865, 14 years old, and trailing behind a wagon train that had left his parents in a grave outside of Missouri. And he had stayed, because staying had seemed easier than running, and eventually, because it had become the only thing he knew how to do. The ranch he had built was called the Double T, though he had never bothered to explain the name to anyone, and it sat on 460 acres of good grass-fed land, with a creek that ran clean most of the year and a barn that was, if Bernard was honest with himself, considerably nicer than the house. He ran cattle, did some horse trading on the side, and kept 2 hired hands named Gus Whitmore and a young man of 20 called Pete Aldridge, who had shown up one autumn asking for work, and had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to calm spooked horses. The house was the problem. Not structurally, Bernard had built it solid, with a real wooden floor and glass windows, which was not nothing in this part of Kansas. The problem was that it was empty in a way that 400 acres of good land could not fill. He had tried filling it with work and had largely succeeded for many years, but there was a particular kind of quiet that settled over the place in the evenings that had begun to feel less like peace and more like something missing. He had not gone looking for the advertisement. His neighbor, a weathered widow named Martha Hollins, who ran 50 head of cattle on the adjacent land with the help of her grown son, had brought it over along with a jar of preserved peaches and had set it on his table without saying a word, which was its own kind of commentary. Bernard had picked it up 3 days later, fully intending to be amused by it, and had not been amused at all. The agency was based in St. Louis, and they specialized in what they called suitable arrangements for frontier gentlemen of good standing. The advertisement in question was for a woman named Ellen Rourke, 26 years of age, from Cincinnati, Ohio. She was described as capable and quiet, with experience in household management, a working knowledge of cooking and preservation, some schooling, and what the advertisement delicately termed an adaptable disposition. Capable and quiet. Bernard had read the words and felt something move in his chest that he could not entirely explain. He had known plenty of capable women in his life and a handful of quiet ones, but the combination, presented plainly and without pretense or embellishment, had struck him as the most honest thing he had read in years. Most advertisements for mail-order brides were practically poetic in their descriptions, full of gentle dispositions and sweet temperaments, and an eagerness to please that sounded more like describing a good hunting dog than a woman. This one had simply said what she was. He had written the agency that same evening. The correspondence took 6 weeks, which was not unusual given the distance and the reliability of the mail in 1879. The agency wrote back to confirm that Ellen Rourke was still available and had expressed interest in his situation upon reading his letter. There was an enclosed note from Ellen herself, written in a clean, careful hand that suggested someone who had been properly schooled, but who was not trying to impress anyone with it. The note said, "I have read your description of the land and the ranch, and I understand it is not an easy life. I want you to know that I am not looking for an easy life. I am looking for a useful one. I have been living in my sister's house in Cincinnati for the past 2 years since the passing of my mother, and I am grateful for her hospitality, but I have known for some time that it is not where I belong. I do not know if Kansas is where I belong either, but I am willing to find out if you are. I should also tell you that I can ride, which the advertisement apparently did not mention, and that I am better with a rifle than most people expect. Bernard had read that note 4 times. Then he had written back immediately and said he thought she sounded exactly right. The arrangement was made, the financial terms settled with the agency, and Ellen Rourke was scheduled to arrive on the westbound train to Caldwell on a Thursday in the second week of June, 1879. Bernard had not slept well the entire week before. He had told Gus and Pete about the arrangement because they would have noticed eventually anyway, and Gus, who was 52 and had opinions about everything, had given him a long considering look, and then said he hoped she could cook because Gus was tired of his own stew. Pete had just grinned and said it was about time. Bernard had told them both to mind their own business, which they had ignored in the cheerful way that men do when they feel entitled to have feelings about their employer's life. He had also told Martha Hollins, who had brought the advertisement over in the first place, and who seemed to regard the whole development as a personal success. She had promptly offered to come to the station when Ellen arrived, which Bernard had accepted before he could think better of it, because he suspected that having Martha there might make the whole thing feel less like a transaction and more like a community, which was what he wanted it to be. The morning of Ellen's arrival, Bernard was awake before the sun. He washed carefully, put on his good shirt, which was a deep blue that his hands had always said made him look like less of a scarecrow, and spent an unreasonable amount of time deciding whether to wear his good hat or his everyday hat before settling on the good hat, which was slightly darker and had a cleaner brim. He ate breakfast without tasting it. He checked the house twice, which he had cleaned thoroughly over the past several days, and then checked the barn because he was a man who found comfort in horses when he was anxious. The mare he kept for himself, a tall bay named Rosie with a white star on her forehead, turned to look at him when he came in and then turned away again as though his anxiety was beneath her notice. He patted her neck anyway. Gus was already hitching the wagon when Bernard came out of the barn, and Pete was leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed, looking amused in a way that Bernard chose not to address. "Relax," Gus said, not looking up from the harness. "She's just a woman. She's coming from Cincinnati to Kansas to marry a man she's never met," Bernard said. "The least she deserves is for me not to be relaxed." Gus paused and looked up at that, and something in the old man's expression shifted to something warmer. "That's a decent thing to say, Bernard." "Thank you, Gus. Now please stop talking." The train from the east was due at the Caldwell station at 11:30 in the morning, and it arrived at 20 minutes past 12, which was actually impressive for that particular line. Bernard had been standing on the platform for 45 minutes with Gus and Martha Hollins, who had brought her son Thomas along, and a small cluster of other townspeople who had nothing better to do than watch a stranger arrive. Caldwell was not a small town, exactly. It had grown considerably as a cattle shipping point, but any arrival of note still drew some measure of attention, and everyone in town knew that Bernard Thatcher had sent for a bride. Bernard stood with his hat in his hands because he had taken it off when the train came into view and then not known what to do with it. Martha was beside him saying something reassuring that he was not fully hearing. The train stopped with a great deal of noise and steam, and people began to pour out of the cars, cowboys and merchants and families with too much luggage, and Bernard found himself scanning every face with a focus that made his jaw tight. He almost missed her because she was the last one off the car. She stepped down onto the platform and paused, one hand still on the railing, and looked around at Caldwell, Kansas, with an expression that Bernard later described to Martha as the most honest face he had ever seen on a person. It was not a grand face, not the kind of beauty that announces itself, but it was the kind of face that held its shape because the person behind it had a clear idea of who she was. She had dark brown hair pinned up under a practical traveling hat, dark eyes that moved steadily and without alarm across the platform, a posture that was straight without being stiff, and she was wearing a gray traveling dress that was well-made and unpretentious. She was carrying her own bags, both of them, one in each hand, and she was scanning the platform with an expression of calm assessment that made Bernard's chest do something complicated. He put his hat back on and walked toward her. She saw him coming and stopped scanning. He was not sure how she knew it was him, but she clearly did because her expression shifted slightly, opening in some way that he could not name, and she set one of her bags down on the platform and waited. "Miss Rourke," Bernard said when he was close enough. "Mr. Thatcher," she said. Her voice was even and clear, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they intend to take seriously. "I hope the journey was tolerable," he said. "It was long," she said. "The food in the dining car was not good, but the landscape coming through the territories was remarkable. I had not expected it to be so large. Kansas tends to surprise people." In which direction? He thought about that. Both, I think, depending on the person. Something shifted in her expression that might have been the beginning of approval, and she picked her bag back up and looked at him squarely. "I appreciate that you came yourself. Some men sent a hand." "It seemed like the right thing," Bernard said. They stood there for a moment in the noise of the platform and the steam and the calling of the cattle being offloaded from the stock cars farther down the line. And Bernard realized that, whatever he had expected this moment to feel like, it had not felt like this. It had not felt like a transaction or an arrangement or a solution to a problem. It had felt like meeting someone. He introduced her to Martha, who took both of Ellen's hands and said with genuine warmth that she was very glad she had come, and to Thomas Hollins, who was 22 and shook her hand with excessive ceremony. And then he helped her to the wagon where Gus was waiting with an expression of studied neutrality that Bernard recognized as Gus being on his best behavior. The drive from the station to the Double T took about 40 minutes across the flat country, and Bernard had prepared himself for the possibility that the silence would be awkward, because he was not naturally a conversational man, and he had been worried about this. But Ellen Rourke looked out at the prairie with that same steady, attentive gaze she had used on the platform, asking questions occasionally about the land and the town and the history of the area, and the questions were specific and practical, and showed that she had been paying attention to what he had written in his letters. "The creek runs clean most of the year," she said, repeating something from his letter. "What does it do when it doesn't?" "Runs muddy in the spring flood," Bernard said. "March usually. Sometimes into April. We collect rainwater in the big barrels through the winter, and we draw from the well on the west side of the property when the creek is out." She nodded as though filing this away. "And the nearest doctor, Dr. Amos Finch in town, he's competent. The nearest hospital would be Wichita." "How far?" 60 miles. She absorbed that without visible alarm. "I know some field medicine," she said. "My mother was sick for a long time. I learned what I could." There was something in the way she said it that did not invite sympathy but did not refuse it either, and Bernard said simply, "That'll be useful here." She looked at him then, and he could see her reading something in his face the way he had been reading things in hers, and she nodded once. Something settled. The Double T came into view around a curve in the road, and Bernard watched her face as it did. The house sat back from the road with the barn beside it and slightly back, and the cottonwood trees he had planted along the creek 7 years ago had grown tall enough to give the place some shade and shape, and the grass in front of the house was green from a recent rain. It was not a grand property, but it was a good one, and it was real, and it had the particular quality of a place that had been built by someone who intended to stay. Ellen looked at it for a long moment. "The barn is bigger than the house," she said. "The barn came first," Bernard said. She turned to look at him with something in her expression that was almost amused. "I suppose that says something about a man's priorities." "The cattle don't care if the floor is level," Bernard said. "I cared if the floor was level." "Is the floor level?" "Mostly." She looked back at the house and said, quietly and to herself more than to him, "It looks like a real place." He was not sure exactly what she meant by that, but he thought he understood it, and he thought it was something close to a compliment. The next days were careful ones. Bernard had arranged for Ellen to have the main bedroom, while he took the smaller room he had been using as a storage space and cleared it out, which Gus had helped him do the week before with considerable commentary. Ellen had accepted the arrangement with straightforward gratitude, and without the excessive protestations that he had been half expecting, and she had spent the first day quietly going through the house with an observant eye, opening cupboards and checking the water situation, and examining the stove with the focused attention of a woman planning a campaign. On the second day she cooked breakfast for all of them, Bernard and Gus and Pete, who ate at the house most mornings, and it was the kind of breakfast that made Gus set his fork down after the first bite and look at Bernard with an expression that said he had been right, and he was not going to say it out loud, which was the most restrained Gus had been in years. After breakfast, Ellen had asked Bernard to show her the whole property, and they had ridden out together, Ellen on a steady sorrel gelding named Chester that Bernard kept for visitors and found to be reliable, and she had ridden well, as her letter had claimed, with the easy competence of someone who had learned young and had kept it up. They rode along the fence lines and down to the creek and up to the north pasture where the main herd was grazing, and Bernard found himself talking about the land with a freedom he had not felt in a long time, because she asked questions that showed she understood what he was telling her, and she offered observations that were precise and occasionally sharp. She noticed that the east fence had a weak section before he pointed it out. She asked about the grass quality in the south pasture and whether it had been rested the previous season. She looked at the cattle with an appraising eye and asked about his breeding program, and when he explained it, she said she thought he was doing it sensibly, which was the kind of compliment that meant more coming from someone who clearly knew the difference. By the time they rode back to the house it was late afternoon, and the light was doing the particular thing it does on the Kansas plains in early summer, going golden and sideways across the grass, and Ellen had taken off her hat to let the wind move through her hair, and Bernard looked over at her riding beside him in that golden light, and felt something in his chest that was so clear and sharp and clean that it almost frightened him. He looked back at the road. "You were right," she said. "About what?" "That it surprises you in both directions. I wasn't sure I was going to like it here. And now," she looked out across the grass for a moment. "I think I might," she said. They were married at the end of that week by the town's minister, Reverend Cole, in a simple ceremony at the church in Caldwell with Martha Hollins and Gus and Pete as witnesses. Ellen wore a dress she had brought from Cincinnati, a deep green that made her look less like someone arriving and more like someone who had always been there. And Bernard wore his good suit and had combed his hair with excessive care and had still managed to present himself at the church with a grass stain on one boot that he had not noticed until they were already inside. Ellen had noticed. She had looked at the boot and then at his face with an expression of absolute solemnity that he recognized immediately as suppressed amusement, and the unexpected delight of being already known that well by someone had made him feel, for the first time in a long time, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Reverend Cole read the words and they said the words back, and when it was done, Martha Hollins cried in a dignified way and Gus shook Bernard's hand with a grip that communicated about 15 years of things unsaid, and Pete accidentally spilled the celebratory punch on the Reverend's wife's hat and then spent 20 minutes apologizing. And Ellen stood at Bernard's side through all of it with that characteristic steadiness that he was beginning to think of as the particular and irreplaceable quality that was most essentially her. The community of Caldwell received Ellen Thatcher, as she was now called, in the way frontier communities receive a newcomer when the newcomer is sensible enough to come without pretension and capable enough to be quickly useful. The women of the town, led to some extent by Martha Hollins, who had appointed herself Ellen's local ambassador, came to call in the first 2 weeks, and Ellen received them all with a warm directness that people found disarming. She was not effusive and she was not performing, and after the first awkward social calls, she found her footing and the relationships became real rather than ceremonial. There was a woman in town named Clara Briggs, about Ellen's age, whose husband ran the dry goods store, and she and Ellen took to each other quickly in the way that certain people do when they recognize in someone else a similar quality of attention. Clara had grown up in Kansas and knew the land and its rhythms, and she became Ellen's first real friend in Caldwell, which mattered more than any of the formal social calls. She asked me about the grasshopper plague of '74, Clara told her husband that evening, with something close to wonder in her voice. She wanted to know exactly how it happened and what people did and whether it could happen again and what the signs were. Nobody who comes from the East asks about the grasshopper plague. Most people from the East don't want to know about the grasshopper plague, her husband said. That's what I mean, Clara said. Life at the Double T settled into its shape. Ellen took on the household management with such thorough competence that Bernard found himself with a small and disorienting amount of mental space. He had previously been devoting to things like whether there was enough salt, and when the preserves needed to be put up, and what he was going to do about the fact that the roof over the back porch had been leaking since March. The roof was fixed by the end of Ellen's second week, with Ellen directing Pete up the ladder while she held the materials and offered precise instructions. And when Bernard came back from the north pasture and found it done, he stood in the yard looking at it for a moment with a feeling he could only describe as gratitude. He was also, gradually and with the particular caution of a man who had not let himself want things for a long time, falling in love with his wife. It was not a sudden thing. It came in accumulated layers, the way good soil builds up, through daily evidence of who she was. The way she talked to the horses, straightforwardly and without the baby talk that some people used, as though they deserved to be addressed as the large, intelligent animals they were. The way she read in the evenings, holding the book at a slight angle to catch the lamplight, and occasionally looked up to share a passage she had found interesting without requiring him to respond in any particular way. The way she handled difficulty, which was with the same steady assessment she used for everything, finding the practical elements first and addressing those, and not indulging in alarm beyond what was warranted. He had been awake at dawn one morning in late June, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and watching the light come up, when Ellen came out in her house dress with her hair not yet pinned and sat in the other chair with her own cup, and they had watched the sunrise together without saying anything for almost 20 minutes, and it had been the most comfortable silence Bernard had ever sat in. "You like the mornings," she said, eventually. "Best part of the day," he said. "I used to hate them," she said. "When my mother was sick, mornings meant another day of it. I had to retrain myself to see them differently when she was gone." He looked at her. "Did it work?" "Most days." She looked out at the sky, which was going from gold to a high clear blue. "Days like this, it works very well." He looked back at the sky. "I'm glad you're here," he said, and said it plainly, the way he said things when he had thought them through and decided they were true. She looked over at him, and her expression was the one he had begun to think of as her open expression, the one that appeared when she was not managing anything but was simply present and without armor, and she said, "I'm glad I came." And the weight of what that meant, the risk of it, what she had left, what she was building was in her voice, and he understood it. After that morning, something changed slightly between them in the way that things change when two honest people both acknowledge a truth at the same time. They were not different with each other exactly, but the space between them was different, warmer and more deliberate, and Bernard found himself making small intentional choices that he had not made before. bringing her the first ripe tomatoes from the garden with the particular care of a man presenting something precious, staying in the evenings rather than going back to work in the barn, asking her what she was thinking when she had that faraway expression that sometimes came over her, not because he needed to know, but because he wanted her to know he noticed. She noticed everything. That was one of the truest things about her. One evening in early July, Bernard came in from a long day of moving cattle to the summer pasture to find the house smelling of something extraordinary, and Ellen at the stove with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming slightly loose, and Pete at the kitchen table looking like a man who had arrived to do something, and had forgotten what it was because of the smell coming from the stove. Ellen had apparently been teaching herself to make a proper beef stew with dumplings, using a recipe from a letter sent by her sister in Cincinnati, and the result was, when it appeared on the table 20 minutes later, the kind of food that makes a person feel that the world is fundamentally arranged correctly. Gus ate 2 bowls and then sat back with the expression of a man who has received a religious experience and is processing it. "Mrs. Thatcher," he said, "I have been eating my own cooking for 11 years. I know," she said. "You told me on my first day. I want you to know that this is better. That is a low bar, Gus, and you know it." Gus laughed, which was not something he did frequently and never lightly, and Pete laughed too, and Bernard sat at the head of the table and felt the warmth of the room and the food and these people who were his, and felt something fill in him that had been empty so long he had stopped noticing the emptiness. He caught Ellen's eye across the table, and she was already looking at him with a small, private smile, and he held her gaze for a moment, and then looked away, because it was getting to the point where looking at her too long in public was a problem he was going to have to address. The 4th of July brought the whole town of Caldwell together for a celebration on the main street, with a barbecue and music, and the particular cheerful chaos of a frontier community that takes its holidays seriously. Bernard and Ellen came to town together on the wagon, and Ellen wore a dress he had not seen before, a pale blue that she had apparently been making in the evenings, and the sight of her climbing onto the wagon seat in that dress in the early morning light had made him stand still in the yard for long enough that she had looked down from the seat and said, "Is something wrong?" "No," he had said. "Nothing at all." He had helped her down from the wagon at the edge of town with his hand at her waist, the first time he had touched her in quite that way, with that particular intention, and she had looked up at him when she was on the ground, and they had been very close for a moment in the noise of the celebration happening around them, and her eyes had been very dark and direct, and he had thought about kissing her with a clarity that was almost embarrassing. He had said, "We should find Martha," and she had said, "Yes," and they had both known that neither of them was talking about Martha at all. The celebration was full and loud and included a fiddle player of genuine skill and a large man named Hector who claimed to be the best shot in Caldwell County and challenged anyone who disagreed to prove it. Several men took him up on it and all of them lost, and then Ellen, who had been watching with that considering expression, said quietly to Bernard, "Do you think he actually is?" "Probably," Bernard said, "because I think I could beat him." He looked at her. "You think you could beat Hector Briggs?" "I said I was better with a rifle than people expect." He thought about her letter about that line and felt a surge of something he could only call pure delight. "Do you want to try?" She considered for a moment, then shook her head. "Not today. I don't want to embarrass him in front of the whole town on Independence Day." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed, actually laughed, out loud, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere genuine, and she looked at him with that near smile, and he thought that he was in serious trouble, and that it was the best kind of trouble he had ever been in. What happened next was a consequence of Hector Briggs, who was good-humored in victory, and had been drinking some of the Independence punch, making a general challenge that anyone who thought themselves a shot should line up and prove it, and Pete Aldridge, who was 20 years old and had spent the last several weeks listening to Ellen describe her shooting skills with increasing detail, had said very loudly that Mrs. Thatcher could beat him. The crowd had turned. Ellen had given Pete a look of spectacular flatness. Pete had given Ellen a look of pure innocent enthusiasm and said, "Well, you said you could." So Ellen Thatcher had stepped up to the shooting line at the edge of the Caldwell Main Street celebration, in her pale blue dress, with Hector's good-natured and mildly skeptical gaze on her, and had shot 6 out of 6 bottles off the fence post at the far end of the demonstration range, including the last one, which Hector had assured everyone was very difficult because it was slightly to the left. There was a moment of complete silence, and then the crowd, which was a frontier crowd and therefore had excellent taste in competence, erupted in honest appreciation. Hector Briggs had looked at his own rifle and then at Ellen and then at Bernard and said, "Where did you find her?" "Cincinnati," Bernard said, and his voice was the voice of a man who is very aware of how fortunate he is. Ellen had handed the rifle back to Hector with a polite nod and walked back to Bernard and stood beside him while the crowd congratulated her, and under the noise of it he leaned down slightly and said quietly, "You were practicing in the mornings." "You noticed," she said. "I heard you behind the barn before I was up. I was going to ask." She looked up at him, that open expression, and said softly, "I wanted to be what the advertisement said." He felt something move through him at that, slow and warm and certain. "You are," he said. "You're exactly that, and considerably more." She held his gaze for a moment in the noise and the crowd and the summer heat, and something was decided between them in that look, without either of them having said the particular words yet. And when she looked away, there was color in her cheeks that he did not think was entirely from the sun. That evening, driving home in the wagon in the cooling air with the stars beginning to appear over the flat dark land, they sat close together on the wagon seat, closer than necessary, the warmth of her arm against his, and she said after a long, comfortable silence, "Bernard, yes, I think I am becoming very attached to this place. The double T, yes, and the creek, and the horses, and the mornings," a pause, "and you." He pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the road because that seemed like the right response to what she had just said, and he turned to look at her in the starlight, and she was already looking at him with that direct, open gaze that he had come to understand as the clearest thing he knew. He said, "Ellen, yes, I have been in love with you for the better part of a month, and I haven't said it because I was trying not to presume." She looked at him for a moment, something moving through her expression, and then she said, "Bernard Thatcher, you are the most careful man I have ever met. Is that a problem?" "No," she said, and her voice was soft and sure. "It's one of the things I love about you." He kissed her then, in the middle of the road under the Kansas stars, a real kiss, and she kissed him back with all the steadiness and warmth and capability that she brought to everything she did. And when they finally drew apart, she rested her forehead lightly against his, and they stayed there for a moment in the particular silence of two people who have just arrived somewhere they had been heading for a long time. "We should get the horses home," she said after a while. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another minute. The summer deepened, and the double T ran full and busy, with the summer heat bringing its particular demands of water hauling and fence checking, and the constant attention that cattle require when the grass is getting dry. Bernard and Ellen worked the ranch together with the kind of practiced efficiency that some couples spend years developing, and that they seem to have arrived at naturally, each understanding without much discussion what the other was doing and what they needed. A quality of partnership that Gus observed with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had watched his employer be lonely for 11 years and was glad to see the end of it. The two of them were not the kind of couple who needed to perform their happiness. It was simply present in the way they moved through a day together, in the small practical kindnesses that had become habit, in the way Bernard always made sure her coffee was hot before his own, and the way Ellen always put the book she thought he would like in the lamp light near his chair without making a production of it, in the way they talked in the evenings across the kitchen table about the things that mattered, the ranch and the land and the people in town and the larger, world that the newspapers brought word of. And in the way they talked about nothing particular too, which was its own kind of intimacy. They had one serious difficulty that summer, which was the matter of a man named Dale Corrigan. Dale Corrigan ran a smaller ranch about 12 miles east and had a long-standing disagreement with Bernard about the location of the boundary fence between their properties, a disagreement that predated Ellen by several years, and that had been kept at a low simmer through an uneasy mutual tolerance. In August, 3 of Bernard's cattle turned up on Corrigan's property, which was not in itself unusual given how fence sections aged and broke. But Corrigan had held the cattle rather than notifying Bernard and sending them back. And when Bernard went to retrieve them, Corrigan had made claims about grazing damages that Bernard found entirely unfounded and said so with more directness than diplomacy. The situation had escalated to the point where Corrigan had come to the Double T on a Wednesday morning in late August with 2 of his hands, and had words with Bernard in the yard that were loud enough for Ellen to hear from the house. She had come to the door and stood in it, watching, and Corrigan had noticed her presence and had said something to Bernard, aimed at her, that was rude in the particular way that certain men are rude to women when they want to insult a man, and women are the quickest instrument. Bernard had taken a step toward Corrigan that was not a friendly step. Ellen had come out of the doorway. She had walked across the yard with that straight-backed walk of hers, and had come to stand beside Bernard and had said to Dale Corrigan, in a voice that was entirely level and clearly audible, that she understood there was a disagreement about the boundary line, and that she would very much appreciate it if they could settle it like grown men by bringing in the county surveyor to settle the question of the line once and for all. Since that would cost less than lawyers and result in a permanent answer that neither party could dispute. There was a pause. Corrigan, who had been gearing up for a confrontation, found himself deflected by the absolute practicality of this and could not immediately find a response to it that was not himself sounding unreasonable. "The surveyor was already here in '73, he said, finally. "Then there should be a record," Ellen said. "If you have it, bring it, and if the record shows the line is where you claim, Bernard will accept it. If it shows otherwise, you'll accept it. That seems like the fair course." Corrigan looked at Bernard and then back at Ellen and then said, with considerably less bluster, that he supposed that was reasonable. The surveyor's record, when retrieved from the county office by Corrigan's own hand a week later, showed the line exactly where Bernard had always claimed it was. Corrigan had not been gracious about it, but he had been quiet, and the cattle dispute was settled, and the 2 ranches returned to their uneasy but functional coexistence. Bernard had that evening taken Ellen's hand across the kitchen table, for no specific reason, just holding it, and she had looked at him and he had said, "Thank you for that." "I was going to say something that would have made it worse." "I know," she said, "I could tell, and you wanted to help." "I wanted to help, and I didn't want you getting into a fight in the yard over a fence line." He turned her hand over in his and looked at it, this capable and calloused hand of a woman who worked, and said, "The advertisement didn't lie." She looked at him with a soft question. "Capable," he said. "They were right about that. They understated it, but they were right." She squeezed his hand and looked down at the table for a moment, and when she looked back up her expression had that quality it sometimes had in the mornings, open and unguarded, the expression that was only for him. "They didn't know the half of me," she said. "I wasn't sure I did either yet. I'm still finding out." "So am I," he said. "I hope it takes a very long time." She smiled at him then, a full smile, the kind that changed her face entirely, and he thought that he had been incredibly lucky, and also that luck had very little to do with it, that this was the result of 2 people choosing carefully and then throwing themselves into the choice with everything they had. Autumn came to the Kansas plains with the particular beauty of that country in the fall, the grass going gold and the sky going a deep October blue and the air sharpening in the mornings. Ellen had put up a remarkable quantity of preserves and dried goods through August and September, with a thoroughness and efficiency that had left the cellar in a state that Gus described, reverently, as organized for survival. She had also started a small kitchen garden that had produced well enough in its first partial season that she was already planning the expansion for next year, sketching out rows on a piece of paper at the kitchen table one evening in October with the lamp throwing gold across the plans. Bernard had come to look over her shoulder at what she was drawing and had stayed there, one hand resting on the back of her chair, leaning in to see the diagram. "You're giving the tomatoes more room," he said. "You ate more tomatoes than anything else," she said, not looking up. "I noticed. I didn't know I ate that many tomatoes." "You had them with everything. It was September. You had tomatoes with your eggs." He thought about that. "They were good tomatoes." "They were good tomatoes," she agreed, and the contentment in her voice, the deep settled pleasure of someone who is doing exactly what they are meant to be doing, was the most beautiful thing he had heard. He pressed a kiss to her hair, which was down for the evening, something he had come to find one of the most quietly intimate things about the day, and she leaned back slightly against him, and they stayed like that for a moment over her garden plans in the lamplight. "I wrote my sister last week," Ellen said. "I know, I saw the letter. She wrote back already. She wants to know if I'm all right." A pause. "She always expected me to come back. She never said it, but I could tell she thought Kansas wouldn't suit me." "And does it?" She turned to look up at him, tipping her head back to see his face, and her expression was absolutely certain. "Bernard, I cannot imagine living anywhere else." He looked down at her, and the certainty in her face met the certainty in his chest, and he said quietly, "Good." "I told her in the letter," Ellen said. "I told her I was more than all right. I told her I was home." He straightened up and held out his hand, and she took it and stood and turned to face him, and they stood in the warm kitchen in the October evening, very close, and he said, "Did you mean that you're home?" "I've never meant anything more," she said simply. He kissed her in a way that meant everything he could not find language for, and she kissed him back the same way, and the lamp burned steadily on the table beside her garden plans, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwood trees along the creek with that particular autumn sound, and the double T held them in it and was home. November arrived, and with it news from the east that reached Caldwell by newspaper, and by the mouths of travelers passing through on the Kishom Trail, which was still active in those years, though it would not be much longer, the encroachment of settlement closing the open range gradually, and with a kind of unstoppable arithmetic that the cowboys who rode it sensed even when they did not speak of it directly. There was a young cowboy who passed through the Double T one November morning, a man named Sam Vetter, no older than 22, riding a horse that was getting worn down and carrying too much on his saddle. He had stopped at the fence line to ask if he could water his horse at the creek. Bernard had been in the yard and had told him yes, and had, after looking at the horse and the young man's face, which had the particular thinned quality of someone who had been going too long on too little, told him to come to the house for something to eat. Ellen had fed Sam Vetter a hot meal without comment, which he had eaten with the focused desperation of someone who had not had a proper meal in several days, and when he was done, she had filled a tin of biscuits and wrapped some dried beef and told him to take it for the road. Sam had looked at the tin and then at her and had said, with a sincerity that was rough around the edges but entirely genuine, that she was the kindest woman he had met since leaving Texas. After he rode on, Bernard had watched him go from the porch and felt the particular sadness of the season, the knowledge that the open cattle drive was ending, that the years of the trail drives were numbered in single digits now, that the world these men had built their identities around was closing around them like a fist. "He'll be all right?" Ellen asked, coming to stand beside him. "I don't know," Bernard said honestly. "The drives are getting harder to find. The railheads are moving and the trail is getting broken up by fences. Men like that are going to have to find something else, and some of them will and some of them won't." She stood with him watching the diminishing figure on the road and said nothing for a moment. Then, "There are a lot of ways the world changes that aren't fair." "Yes," he said. "The land belonged to others before it belonged to us," she said. It was not a question, and it was not a speech, just a statement of the thing that sat underneath everything in this country, the thing that people in the East often forgot, and people here tended to either feel acutely or train themselves very deliberately not to. The Osage were moved from this land. They were, he said, the caw before them, the whole territory was remade. She was quiet for a moment. "I think about that sometimes. When I look at the land and feel how much I love it, I think about what it cost." He looked at her profile, this woman who did not look away from hard truths, and said, "I think about it too." She turned to look at him, and their eyes held for a moment, and then she leaned slightly against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there in the November cold, and held the weight of it together, which was not nothing. Winter settled over the Double T with its particular Kansas severity, the cold coming down from the north with the flat, unobstructed force that the plains allow, and life in the house became its own world, close and warm and interior. The evenings grew long and lamplit, and Bernard and Ellen read together and talked together and played cards, which Ellen played with a strategic intelligence that had made Gus quit after losing 6 hands in a row and Pete throw his hat across the room in theatrical despair. It was in December that Bernard noticed Ellen was quieter than usual in a specific way, not her ordinary quietness, which was a form of present attention, but a quietness that had an interior quality, a woman thinking about something she had not yet decided to say. He waited a few days, because he had learned that her timing was always purposeful, and on a Friday evening when they were sitting by the fire after supper, she set her book down and looked at him with the direct, open expression and said, "I believe we may be expecting a child." He looked at her for a moment, and the feeling that moved through him was enormous and warm and slightly terrifying in the best possible way, and he said, "You believe?" "I'm fairly certain," she said. "Given the timing, I would say July." He set his own book down. "Are you all right? Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling very well," she said. "Slightly tired in the mornings, but otherwise I am absolutely fine, Bernard. Please don't look at me like I might shatter." He realized he was leaning forward in his chair with an expression of concentrated concern and consciously settled back. "I'm sorry. I know," she said, and her voice was gentle. "But I'm all right. I'm strong and I'm healthy, and we are on a proper ranch with a good cellar and a creek and Dr. Finch in town, and I intend to work until it is not sensible to work, and then I intend to have this baby in the ordinary way and be back to the garden within a month." He looked at her and recognized the particular tone that meant she was stating a plan rather than asking for permission, and he said, "I know you're strong." "Good." She held his gaze. "Are you happy?" "Ellen," he said, and his voice came out low and certain, "I have been happy every day since you arrived, but right now I am—" He stopped because the word he wanted was not large enough. "I know," she said, and she smiled at him, and it was the full smile, the real one, and it went all the way through him. He moved to sit beside her on the settee, and she leaned into him, and he held her with the particular careful tenderness of a man who is aware of exactly how much he has to lose, and has decided to be grateful for it rather than afraid. And she rested her head against his shoulder, and they watched the fire for a long time together in the quiet of the December night. He told Gus the next morning, primarily because Gus would have noticed something had changed and would have asked pointed questions until he found out anyway. Gus had looked at him for a long moment and then, surprisingly, had cleared his throat and looked away and said, gruffly, that he was glad. Bernard had recognized the emotion in the old man's voice and had not commented on it, because Gus's dignity was important to Gus and Bernard respected that. Pete had made a noise like a young man who has been waiting for good news and is relieved to finally receive it, and had immediately offered to build a cradle, which offer was accepted. Martha Hollins had come to call that afternoon because Martha always seemed to know things before they were told to her, and she had taken Ellen's hands and held them for a moment and said, with the particular warmth of a woman who had loved the children she'd raised and knew exactly what was coming. "You are going to be wonderful." Ellen had looked at her and said, "I'm going to try very hard." "That," Martha said, "is the most important part." Spring came back to the plains, and Ellen was rounded and capable and steady right through March and April, continuing to oversee the house and the garden with her usual thoroughness, adapting her work as needed without complaint, and without requiring anyone to make a production of her condition. She had decided opinions about what she could and could not manage, and informed Bernard of these opinions with clarity, which he received with gratitude because it meant he did not have to guess. There was a late April afternoon when a hard spring storm came in from the southwest, the sky going green in the particular way that makes every Kansas farmhand look at the horizon with a specific kind of attention, and Bernard had been in the far north pasture checking a fence section that had been damaged by the winter when he saw it coming. He had ridden Rosie hard back to the house, arriving in the yard just as the wind picked up and the first drops hit, and had been halfway to the house when he saw Ellen already moving the chickens into the coop and latching the barn door. He had taken over the barn while she got inside, and by the time the storm hit in earnest they were both in the house with the windows shuttered and the cellar hatch secured, sitting at the kitchen table listening to the thunder and the rain hammer the roof, and Ellen was drinking tea with both hands around the cup and looking completely unperturbed. "Were you scared?" Bernard asked. "Of the storm?" "No." She looked at him calmly. "Were you scared?" "Riding back and seeing you in the yard with the sky looking like that," he said. "Yes." She looked at him over her teacup. "I was fine." I know you were fine." He looked at his hands. "It doesn't stop you from being scared." She set the teacup down and reached across the table and covered his hands with hers, and her touch was warm and sure, and he turned his hands over and held hers, and they sat there listening to the storm diminish and the air come clean through the storm cracks in the window frames, and she said, "I'm not going anywhere, Bernard." He looked at her. "I'm not," she said, firmly and quietly, with all the force of a person who means every word. "I'm here. I'm not fragile, and I'm not going anywhere, and this child is going to be born in the summer, and we are all three of us going to be here on this ranch together, and that is what is going to happen." He held her hands and believed her, because Rourke Thatcher had never told him anything that was not true, and he said, "All right." "Good," she said. The storm moved on, and they could hear the chickens complaining in the coop, and somewhere the creek was running high, and Gus was probably swearing about something, and the lamp burned on the kitchen table between their joined hands, and outside the plains smelled like rain and new grass and the particular promise of everything that was coming. The baby arrived on the 14th of July, 1880, in the middle of a hot Kansas summer, with Dr. Finch present and Martha Hollins assisting, and Bernard banished to the porch by Martha, who informed him with kind firmness that he was not helping by being in the room and was absolutely helping by staying out of it. He had sat on the porch for 4 hours with Gus, who had brought a bottle of good whiskey and had poured Bernard exactly 1 glass and himself 2, and they had sat in the July heat without saying much because there was not much to say. And then there had been a sound from inside the house that was new to the world, a voice that had never existed before, and Bernard had been on his feet before he knew it, and Gus had put a hand briefly on his arm and said, "Wait." Martha had come to the door a few minutes later with the look of a woman carrying good news, and had said, "You have a son, Bernard, and Ellen is perfectly well and would like you to come in." He had gone in, and Ellen was in the bed with the particular exhausted radiance of a woman who has done the hardest thing and come through it, and she had the baby against her chest, a red-faced and furious-looking small creature who was, even so, clearly and specifically a person, and she had looked up at Bernard when he came through the door, and her expression had been the open one, the real one, only multiplied by something enormous. He had sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby and at her, and had not been able to speak for a moment. "A boy," she said. "I heard." His voice was rough. He reached out and touched the baby's hand, which was tiny and perfectly formed, and the baby's hand had curled around his finger with a grip of surprising determination, and Bernard had made a sound that was not a word. "He's strong," Ellen said, and there was a quiet pride in it. "Takes after his mother," Bernard said. She looked at him and her eyes were bright. Not tears exactly, or perhaps tears, the kind that come from fullness rather than grief, and she said, "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names through the winter and spring, making lists and crossing things out, and Bernard had a name that he had been holding for a long time, from the man who had helped him most in his first years in Kansas, a rancher who had given a 14-year-old orphan work and direction, and had died of a fever in 1872 before Bernard had been able to thank him properly. "James," Bernard said, "if you still want it." "James Thatcher," Ellen said, and looked down at the baby with an expression of complete and certain love. "Yes, that's right." They named him James William Thatcher, the William for Ellen's father, and he was, from his first hours, the kind of baby who seemed to have opinions about everything, which his parents found both exhausting and extremely appropriate. Life on the Double T in the years following James's arrival had the particular quality of something that has found its full form. Bernard expanded the herd the following spring, adding 20 good cattle and breeding 3 new horses, and Ellen had expanded the kitchen garden into a proper large-scale operation that supplied not only the ranch but a regular market arrangement with Clara Briggs's husband at the dry goods store, trading preserved goods and fresh produce for supplies, an arrangement that proved significantly advantageous for both parties. Pete Aldridge had taken on full responsibilities as head ranch hand by 1881, his natural skill with horses having developed into a genuine expertise that drew neighboring ranchers to ask Bernard for recommendations, and Bernard had raised his pay and his responsibilities accordingly. Gus, who was 54 and beginning to feel his years in the cold mornings, had settled into an elder statesman role, doing lighter work and operating primarily as the ranch's institutional memory and moral compass, a function he filled with considerable satisfaction. James Thatcher turned out to be a child of remarkable energy and equal curiosity, walking at 10 months to everyone's terror, and talking in complete sentences at 18 months to no one's surprise at all, given his parentage. He had his father's coloring and his mother's eyes and his own entirely individual temperament, which combined Ellen's steadiness with Bernard's determination and added something extra that seemed to be purely his own. He was devoted to the horses from the time he could walk to them, which pleased Pete enormously and concerned Bernard, who was aware of how large horses are relative to very small children, and Ellen had handled this by teaching James correctly and early, standing him in front of Rosie when he was 2 years old and saying in her practical voice that a horse was a large animal who deserved respect. And James had looked at Rosie with his mother's serious dark eyes, and then had reached up and patted her nose with a careful hand, and Rosie had bent her head down toward him in a way she rarely did for adults, and Pete had said that right there was a natural horseman and had been largely correct. In the fall of 1882, Ellen discovered she was expecting again, which she announced to Bernard at breakfast one September morning with the same matter-of-fact directness she had used the first time, and Bernard had looked up from his coffee with the same enormous warm feeling he had had the first time, perhaps augmented by the additional context of knowing exactly what it meant. "Another July?" he asked. She thought about it. "April, I think. April is better, milder." "That is my hope," she said, and then James, who was 2 years old and had been listening with bright-eyed attention from his chair, said, "What are we getting in April?" And they had both looked at him, and then at each other and started laughing, and James had laughed too without knowing why, because the happiness in the room was the kind you catch like sunlight. Their second child arrived on a mild April morning in 1883, and this time Bernard was more practiced at the business of waiting on the porch, though not significantly calmer, and Gus, who had now done this twice, produced the whiskey with the weary expertise of a man who has a process. When Martha came to the door, she was smiling with the particular smile of someone carrying something unexpected, and she said, "Twin girls, Bernard, both perfectly well. Ellen, too." He had, reportedly, sat back down. James, who had been at Martha's house during the birth and who was brought back by Thomas Hollins on a horse, had walked into the bedroom with his small, serious face arranged in an expression of tremendous importance, looked at the two small, red-faced creatures in the bed with his mother, and announced that they were very small and he supposed they could stay. Ellen had laughed until she cried, or possibly just cried, and Bernard had held her hand and looked at his 3 children and his wife in the afternoon light, and felt something so complete that he understood, in a way he had not before, that this was what his whole life had been building toward. Not just the ranch or the land or even Ellen, though those were part of it, but this specific afternoon with this specific light and these specific people. All of it assembled from a choice made on a winter morning when a lonely man had read an advertisement and felt something recognize itself. They named the girls Clara Me, after Clara Briggs, who had become one of Ellen's dearest friends, and Frances Ruth, for Bernard's mother, and from their first weeks they were as different from each other as 2 children of the same womb can be. Clara determined and loud, and Frances thoughtful and observant in a way that made her father say, quietly and privately to Ellen, that Frances was going to know everything about everyone before she was 5. Like her mother, Bernard said. "I never said I know everything," Ellen said. "You don't have to say it," Bernard said. The years moved the way good years do, quickly but with weight, each one distinct in the memory and thick with the accumulated texture of a life fully lived. James grew into an earnest and capable boy who loved horses and was developing a genuine talent for figures and mathematics that surprised no one who knew his mother and delighted his father, who had always struggled with the accounting side of ranching. The twins were inseparable and also constantly at odds in the specific way of twins, who are different enough to disagree about everything and close enough to always be on each other's side when the disagreement involved anyone else. In 1884, Bernard and Ellen celebrated their 5th anniversary, which Ellen marked by finishing and presenting to Bernard a project she had been working on in secret for most of the previous year. A proper written history and record of the Double T, its land, its cattle lines, its history, everything she had learned from Bernard and from documents and from the county records, compiled in a leather-bound journal in her precise and readable hand, illustrated with small, careful sketches she had made of the property in different seasons. He had sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in his hands and had not said anything for a long time, turning the pages, and when he finally looked up his expression was the one she associated with the deepest things in him, the ones he did not often bring to the surface. "Ellen," he said. "It's a ranch history," she said, slightly more carefully than usual, because this mattered to her enormously and she was not entirely sure what he would say. "So James and the girls will know it. And whoever comes after them, so it doesn't get lost. It's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "It's a book, Bernard. It's not just a book," he said. "It's every conversation we've had about this place for 5 years. It's everything you paid attention to that I never wrote down. He stopped and looked at her. "Do you know what you did when you came here?" She waited. "You loved this place," he said. "You loved it with your whole attention, the same way you do everything. You learned it and you cared about it and you made it into something that had a future." He set the journal down carefully. "I built it, but you made it mean something." She crossed the kitchen and sat beside him and took his face in both her hands, which was a gesture she rarely used and which always meant something essential, and she looked at him for a long moment with all the directness and warmth that were her and said, "Bernard Thatcher, you were building a life without knowing how to make it come alive. All I did was come and love what you had made. That," he said, "is the whole thing." She kissed him, in the kitchen in the afternoon, with the sounds of the children somewhere outside and Gus's voice carrying from the direction of the barn and the wind in the cottonwoods along the creek. And it was the kiss of 5 years together, and everything those years had held. In the spring of 1885, Pete Aldridge announced that he was getting married. He had been seeing a woman in town named Ruth Ann Prescott for the better part of a year, a quiet and practical schoolteacher who had arrived in Caldwell the previous fall, and the announcement was made at the breakfast table with the particular combination of excitement and terror that marks a young man making the biggest decision of his life. Ellen had immediately expressed genuine and enthusiastic delight, which was the first thing she said, and then had immediately begun making practical suggestions about housing, which was the second thing she said, and Pete had laughed and said that was exactly what Ruth Ann had done when he told her, and Ellen had looked pleased to have something important in common with the woman Pete had chosen. Bernard had shaken Pete's hand and told him that he was glad for him, and that if he needed anything he had only to ask, and that his position at the Double T was as solid as the ranch was, which was his way of saying that Pete was not just a hired hand but something closer to family, which everyone had understood for years and which was good to say out loud. Ruth Ann Prescott, when she came to the Double T for Sunday dinner 2 weeks later, turned out to be a woman of similar qualities to Ellen in the most important respects. Attentive and practical and warm in a way that was not performed, and she and Ellen had spent most of the dinner in deep conversation about the school curriculum in Caldwell and the question of whether the school board might be persuaded to add more natural science to the program. And Bernard had watched Ellen's face alive with engagement and had leaned over to Pete and said quietly that he was a lucky man. And Pete, watching Ruth Ann with everything he felt visible on his young face, had said he knew it. The wedding was in June, a proper summer celebration, and the Double T contributed to the feast with Ellen's best preserves and a roasted side of beef, and a cake that Ellen and Clara Briggs made together over 2 days with a seriousness of collaborative purpose that the men wisely did not interrupt. It was the kind of wedding that Caldwell did well, large and warm and full of people who meant it. That fall, Martha Hollins's health began to decline. She had been slowing for a year or two, the way strong women sometimes do when they have pushed past the pace their bodies can sustain, and by October she was spending more time inside and less time on her own land, with Thomas Hollins handling most of the ranch work. Ellen had begun going to see her 2 or 3 times a week, bringing food and company, and sometimes Bernard came too, and they would sit with Martha in her kitchen and talk about the town and the ranch and the years they had all been there, and Martha would hold Ellen's hand with the grasp of someone who knows what she is holding. In November, Martha told Ellen that she was very glad she had left that advertisement on Bernard's table. "I was afraid he was going to become a very lonely old man," Martha said. "He was so determined to be all right by himself that I thought he might actually manage it." "He was managing it," Ellen said. "Managing is not the same as living," Martha said, with the certainty of a woman who knew the difference. "You made him live. I want you to know I saw that." Ellen had held Martha's hand and said that Martha had given her the chance and that she would not forget it. Martha Hollins died in December of 1885, peacefully in her own bed, with Thomas beside her and Ellen there too, and Caldwell mourned her with the particular grief of a community losing one of its pillars, and Bernard stood at her grave in the cold December air and said goodbye to one of the constants of his life, and Ellen stood beside him and held his arm with both of hers, warm and present and steady. And he leaned slightly into her, and was grateful in the wordless way that goes deeper than speech. They planted a cottonwood tree on the Double T in Martha's memory, in a spot along the creek where the afternoon light hit long and gold, and it grew over the years into the tallest tree on the property. Life went on with the beautiful ordinariness that is the best kind of life. James, at 7, was beginning his proper schooling, and Ruth Ann Aldridge had become his teacher, which James regarded as an excellent arrangement because Mrs. Aldridge was, in his considered opinion, the kind of teacher who explains things properly, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Frances, who was 3, had developed the habit of following Bernard around the ranch with a thoughtful expression and asking questions about everything she saw, a habit that Bernard found entirely endearing and entirely expected. Clara, equally 3, had developed the habit of organizing everything she could reach into systems that made sense to her and were impenetrable to everyone else. The Double T in 1886 was a thriving and living thing. The herd had grown to well over 200 head. The horse breeding operation Pete had helped develop was known in the territory. The kitchen garden had evolved into a proper commercial operation, and the house had been expanded with a new room and a proper covered porch that ran the length of the front, which Bernard had built over one long autumn, and which Ellen had declared the finest addition to the property since the glass windows. Bernard was 41 and felt it in his shoulders some mornings, but felt it the way a man feels the evidence of a life he chose, not as complaint but as testimony. Ellen was 33, with the particular beauty of a woman who has grown into herself, which is the most enduring kind, and who moves through the world with the confidence of someone who knows what she is capable of and has proven it to herself at every turn. They sat on the new front porch on a September evening in 1886, the two of them, in the hour after supper when the children were doing their evening things, and the last light was going gold and long across the grass. And Bernard had his coffee and Ellen had her tea, and neither of them was saying anything because they had the particular comfort of people who have long since passed the need to fill silences. The prairie stretched out in front of them, enormous and golden in the evening light, and the creek was audible from where they sat, and somewhere in the barn Pete was talking to one of the horses in the low, easy way he had, and the light was doing the thing it does in September, making everything look like the best version of itself. "You know what I think about sometimes," Ellen said. "What?" "The day I stepped off the train." She looked out at the prairie. "I had been on that train for 3 days. I was tired and the food was bad, and I had no idea what I was going to find. And I stepped off and I looked around at this place, this enormous flat country with all this sky, and I thought, it's real, it's actually real." He looked at her profile in the evening light. "Were you afraid?" "A little," she said. "Not of the place. I was afraid I wouldn't be enough for it." She turned to look at him. "That sounds strange." "It doesn't," he said. "I felt the same way about the advertisement," she said. "Capable and quiet. I thought, what if I get there and I'm not? What if it was just words?" He set his coffee down. "Ellen, I know," she said, and her voice was soft. "I know now, but I didn't know then." "You were exactly what it said," he said. "And then about 100 things besides." She looked at him for a long moment in the evening light. "You put that advertisement in your pocket and kept it," she said. "I found it last spring in your old coat." He was quiet. "You kept it," she said again, not pressing, just noting with the gentleness of someone who understands what it means. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He thought about how to answer that and then said what was true. "Because it was the beginning," he said. "And the beginning is worth keeping." She looked at him for a moment, and her expression was all the thing she was, direct and warm and steady, and full of the particular love that had built over 7 years into something as solid and real as the ranch they sat on. And she reached over and covered his hand with hers and said, "Yes, it is." They sat together on the porch as the light went arose, and the first stars came out over the Kansas plains, and the crickets started in the grass. And from inside the house came the sounds of children, and the smell of the lamp being lit by one of the children doing their responsible evening task. And it was the sound and smell of everything that was right and real and chosen. Bernard turned his hand over under hers and held it, and she leaned slightly against him, her shoulder warm against his, and he thought of every specific thing that had brought him here. The terrible loss at 14 that had stranded him on these plains, the years of working and building and refusing to stop, The night he had read a piece of smeared paper by lamplight and felt something in him recognize itself. The woman who had stepped off a train with her own bags in both hands and her eyes open, and had looked at Kansas and found it real. He thought of James asleep in the house and the twins in their room probably not asleep, and Pete in the barn and the cottonwood growing by the creek in Martha's name, and the herd in the north pasture and the garden plan folded in Ellen's kitchen drawer, and the journal on the shelf with the history of this place written in her careful hand. All of it from an advertisement on a cheap piece of paper. Capable and quiet, it had said. He had been looking for both his whole life. He looked over at her in the last of the evening light. His wife, this woman who had come to him out of pure decision and had been exactly what she said and far more than he had known to hope for. And she was already looking at him with that expression. The open one, the real one, and the warmth between them was the warmth of 7 years and a family and a life built on honesty and work, and the particular miracle of 2 people who chose each other, and then chose each other again every day. "Bernard," she said. "Yes. I love you," she said, plainly and directly and completely the way she said everything. "I love you," he said back the same way. The stars came out over Kansas, one by one and then all at once, the way they do on the plains where there is nothing to interrupt them, and the double T held its people under that enormous sky, and the lamp burned in the window, and the creek ran in the dark, and it was good, and it was whole, and it was home. They would have 15 more years on this porch in just this way, watching the seasons come and go across the grass, watching James grow into a young man who would one day take on a portion of the ranch with his father's hands and his mother's mind, watching the twins become 2 extraordinary and entirely distinct women, watching Pete and Ruth and build a life of their own, and fill it with children who ran back and forth across both properties with no clear idea of where one family ended and the other began. Which was exactly right. They would see the old open trail era close entirely, and the fences come, and they would watch Caldwell change and grow and change again, and they would outlast the hardest winters and the driest summers, and through all of it the double T would stand solid, and the creek would run, and the cottonwood Martha's tree would grow wider and taller and cast more shade every year. But on that September evening in 1886, none of that was yet, and all of it was coming, and the man who had read the advertisement and the woman who had been described in it sat on their porch with their hands joined, and the stars coming out above them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. She had come described as capable and quiet. He had read those words and known. And she had come, and it had been true, and it had been the truest start of the truest thing. And the life they built from it was the kind that earns its own permanence, not from greatness or fame or the notice of the world, but from the daily accumulated fact of 2 people who showed up for each other without reservation, who told each other the truth, who worked the land and raised the children and watched the plains in the evening light and understood, without ever needing to say it in so many words, that this was the whole point, this was what a life was for, and that they had found it, and they were keeping it together for as long as the Kansas sky would hold them. Which was, as it turned out, a very long time indeed.